So, Precedented Parroting is a book of poetry on palimpsest press, and it's very, well, beautiful is sort of a common word, but it's very poignant to me, and very interesting, the use of uh, the theme of birds throughout the book. And I was very struck by, I think maybe this might be a theme in your writing or has been for a while, because a lot of the imagery from the story in Watermark was also about birds on the seashore. And I wonder if we could start maybe just talking about birds.
Oh, what a lovely way to start.
Great.
I think, at least partially, the way into birds as a metaphor for me was this idea of flight, um, both flight away from something and flight towards something. And tied to the literal flight, also, I think, is a flight of fancy. So I was thinking partially about the imagination and how that can also be freeing.
When you say a flight towards and a flight away, of course, I think about the journey that you refer to in most of these poems, in one way or another, in this book, which was from Vietnam originally. And I'm not sure, actually, if you came to America, if you're in Canada now, exactly where you're located presently. But it was a journey that's not quite all the way here or there, I sometimes feel, from the
Mm,
poetry.
that's so interesting. I mean, I suppose I left it somewhat ambiguous because I wanted people to be able to identify wherever here was and there was for them, for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but also, so my entire family had immigrated from Vietnam to the United States, and I was the only one born in the United States. But ironically, um, I immigrated from the US to Canada. So when I was writing Precedented Parroting, the title poem, I was thinking about the fact that I too had flown the coop, even though, for most people, arriving in New York City and living in New York City is the dream, and I had left it.
Interesting. But the birds, to get back to the birds, because you go into a lot of detail, really. I think you've studied birds, or I get the feeling that you've really gotten deeply into. And I love to watch birds. Where I live, I see red-tailed
Mm.
hawks and great blue herons and different kinds of ducks. Even have like geese nesting right now, on wild geese that are nesting on the property. And they are somehow both um, they're very fragile in a way, and especially when they're nesting, and the many of the baby birds don't even survive because of all the prey, and it's somehow just that vulnerability as well, I think, is conveyed in these poems. And you refer to a particular parrot actually having the ability, or the only animal that has ever actually asked a question of what color it is. So I wondered if we could get a little deeper into your relationship with actual birds, or knowledge about birds. And I'm assuming that you've also spent time, like I have, just watching the birds.
Yes, I've spent quite a bit of time watching birds, and also when I was working on this book, I was living temporarily in LA, and feathers just kept coming to me: hawk feathers, jay feathers, parrot
Mm,
feathers, raven feathers. I just felt inundated by them, and I felt like something was happening there. Um, I suppose tied to the story of my father is the story of, as you mentioned, Alex, the gray parrot. And I think of him because he too, I feel, was maligned and misunderstood and underestimated insofar as parrots are so smart and we have so many disparaging words about birds. And it turns out that when we developed the phrase bird-brained to refer to their limited capacity, it was our limited capacity, our hubris, that led us to that phrase insofar as we thought that they had a lesser ability because their brains are structured differently. So we thought they're lacking this, this part, and therefore they must be lesser. Whereas it turns out that they actually are able to perform the same functions. Their brains are simply structured differently. And it also turns out that they acquire language in much the same way that humans do. And I just kept thinking about the fact that, we just look at difference and we think that's lesser because clearly we are superior. And I couldn't help but tie this to how we land ourselves in this place of just, after my father emigrated 60 years ago, and I think of him as that, that exotic bird who landed in the United States and was viewed as something other and lesser, and who didn't speak the language and was learning to mimic it, even though he did speak the language. And I think, here we are 60 years later, and have we advanced? We're still in this place. We're still, certain groups are still fighting to prove their humanity, that they are not lesser, that they are human. And it's kind of devastating.
It is a devastating moment in time right now for, I think, people all over the world just trying to understand what is going on and how can we be led by such, I don't know, ignorance, really. And yet it has such power over us, to where nobody can even make decisions based on what they think might be happening these days. So I do feel what you're saying there. And I wonder, your story as an immigrant is tied to war. The war between with America, and I think the time that you came and immigrated was connected to some of those things that were going on in that period of time. And you talk about the language, the Vietnamese language in the book, and I was really struck by that idea that there's not this reference about time like we speak in English, and how that really must affect the way people think differently when they have like different ways of referring. So one of your poems referenced the idea that you get a sense of time more from comparing things to things, and I wondered if you could talk a little about that, and even how familiar you are with being able to speak Vietnamese since you grew up in America.
Thank you. That's a really astute observation about the different ways in which one would reference the world and one's place in the world. I think part of what's been difficult for me is, as the only one in my family who was born in the US, I didn't grow up speaking Vietnamese, and further, my parents, for probably a multitude of reasons, decided that they did not want me to speak Vietnamese as I was growing up. And so I grew up understanding it, but not, or understanding very basic Vietnamese, mostly food. But not having that same context from the rest of the members of my family made things pretty challenging for me. And as I was growing up, I didn't think about it concretely in terms of the language not having this reference to time. And now as an adult, I look at it and I think it's so related to the ways in which immigrants must live our lives, in terms of there's no clean line between past and present. There's no clean line between here and there. We're kind of always in both places. And I think it's somewhat unfair to think, oh, that was the past and now you must let go and you must be here, because there's always a life going on, even after you've left that place. And the way in which the Vietnamese language facilitates that is now, at this point in my life, I think kind of beautiful, because it does actually reflect the way in which my parents lived in both places. It was still very present to them.
And that reminds me actually of an interview I did recently with Eileen Tabios, who's from the Philippines, and she talks about kapwa, which is a sense of, everything is related, and even across time, that there's really not time in the sense that we think of a clock ticking, because the past is related to the present and the future as well. But you illustrate this in some of your poems by talking about the family picture album, which I thought was very poignant, and this idea that you didn't actually understand a lot about who your father was and in your life, as a young child, and even the different experience, like you said, that you were born in America, but your sisters and brothers came over from Vietnam. And so these pictures that fall out of the family album, and it almost doesn't matter what order they're put in there or what year that happened. So that wasn't really a question, but I thought maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
I actually do have a comment on that. So I would say about 5 years ago, there was a Vietnamese French author who was appearing somewhere, and a friend told me that I should go meet him because perhaps his father knew my father, because they had both spent time at the consulate in the Philippines at the same time. And so I went and introduced myself by showing a photo of my father with another man in the Philippines. And I don't, because of how my family immigrated, I don't have photos of my parents before a certain year. So I only have access to photos of them as adults, as parents. But anyway, I was speaking to Marcelino Trung, who's a writer in France, and it turned out that his father had photos of my father.
Oh, interesting.
And I had never seen them. And it was just astounding to be let into this part of his life that was not accessible to me until then. And I didn't think any photos from that time period existed any longer. It was just remarkable to realize that or to be able to see that part of his life.
That's a remarkable story, and I think probably was very gratifying experience. Could we take a little break and have you read a little bit of this poetry that we're talking about for our listeners to get a sense of this whole conversation, what it's actually about? I would really appreciate that.
Do you have a specific poem in mind?
I don't. I would like to let you choose. But I guess I was talking about the family photos, and I did feel like that was just, I should have saved the spot in your book, which has a really gorgeous cover, by the way.
Oh,
Putting it up here.
That cover art is by Ian Ha, who is also a writer and lives in New York.
Oh, nice.
Were you
Maybe,
thinking of Unframed on page
yes.
46?
Yes, I was. That would be great.
Unframed. In the Vietnamese language, there is no present or past tense. Verbs are not conjugated. Time is discerned through context. Without context, there is no going or gone or will go. You can only be. In my family's photo albums, photos are arranged in no particular order. On the left, my family before a cathedral in Montreal. On the right, my sisters in saris. Falling out of the album, American students marching in support of the war in Vietnam. About 3 inches wide with decal-edged frames, sepia-tone photos of people I don't know, but see in my mother's face. My father in a cowboy hat in the desert.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Um, I wondered a bit about how long it took you to write this book and what your process was in, like, how do you approach writing a poem as opposed, because you did read fiction from Watermark, and so I don't know if you've written a novel, but maybe just how you even decide if you write a poem or a story, and if you have different approaches for those.
Oh, Martha, it's been such a struggle.
I feel that, and I know that struggle.
I don't always know what it is when I start, so I don't always know what form it should take. And so this book took me forever because parts of it began in a different form. So some of the text here in the book actually was longlisted for the CBC Nonfiction Prize
Oh,
as
interesting.
as a lyric essay.
Uh-huh.
And I kept looking at it and thinking it's not the right form, and also that it should not exist in one long string. So I kind of unraveled it and layered it with other poems, and for me, it feels much more organic.
And so, how long did it take you to assemble this volume of poetry?
I
Was
mean,
it?
I feel like I've been writing it for decades. The actual, I don't even know how to answer that question because I feel like so many other pieces of writing have gone into what the book finally became. The actual assembly, I think, when I knew that I had enough work and that I needed to cut some other things out, went more quickly. It was difficult for me actually to find a publisher, and I think it was partially because I wasn't yet finding the form. And when I finally found the form, and there are a lot of visual forms in this collection, and I think that was part of my search. I think for me to it needed to take its visual form and its kind of oral form. I feel like those two for me are so tied together. I like poems from my own writing. I like poems that work for the ear. And I don't know how much of that is because I grew up listening to a tonal language. So while I was structuring this book, the way the words landed on the page was so important to me. And someone asked me about white space, and there is a significant amount of white space, but
There is, yes.
there are also places where I interrupt the white space with these giant parentheses. And for me, it's that when there's a lot of white space, intellectually we know that the writer intended for us to be quiet and still for a moment and give the lines time to breathe. but I feel like, at least for me, my tendency is if there's a lot of white space, my eye goes directly to the little bit of text that's on the page. And what I wanted here, where there are giant parentheses, is for the reader to be reminded that yes, there's this white space, but I want you to stay here in this white space for a bit, and I want you to think about what might be here.
I do feel that a lot of the poetry sort of points to that feeling of what might be the backstory, what might be the facts that you don't have, that you could fill in to have a coherent story that you could tell. And I want to say from beginning to end, which brings me back to the idea of not having that concept in Vietnamese language again. So maybe there's, I don't know, is there a struggle sometimes between thinking in one language or one culture, I want to say, or another culture, and somehow trying to exist within that space to know who you are or where you come from? Or that seems to be what the book's exploring. Let me say it like that.
It's interesting, while you were talking, I was thinking there are two things that are very related here. I struggled a lot when I was growing up with who I was and where I fit in. I think more so than, most of us struggle just growing up. Partially because in my family, I always felt far more Western. Number one, I didn't grow up speaking Vietnamese. I wasn't as familiar with the culture because I'd never lived there. So at home, I was always too American. And then out in the world, I was always viewed as, Asian or Vietnamese. And so it was difficult for me to figure out what I was because everyone thought I was something other. And there was no real place for that. And I wonder, more recently, I've been wondering if that is related to the reason why it's difficult for me to settle on one particular writing form, why it's never just short story or poetry, why I have to switch gears, because I feel like neither one fully captures what I'm after.
We started out, I talked about Watermark, which was a landmark anthology of Vietnamese American writers, and we met over that book, I think 30 years ago almost, at WBAI Radio in New York City. And I would guess that that anthology, which has now had a reprinting at its 25-year anniversary, maybe it has helped some of those writers to publish more work, or for people to become more familiar with the work of Vietnamese American writers. And you mentioned that you had some problems getting this recent book, Precedented Parroting, published. And I would just wonder, what has that journey been from the time that Watermark came out with your beautiful story, Rosary, all the way to this most recent book of Precedented Parroting?
It's been so fulfilling that even this far out, after 30 years, as you were saying, that Watermark is still forging connections amongst the community and internationally even. So I live in Toronto now, and I've been able to meet someone who received Watermark in the mail when he was living in snowy Calgary and was, a lonely immigrant boy, and he is now the author of a memoir, The Migrant Rain Falls in Reverse. Vinh Nguyen contributed to the 25th anniversary edition, and his work is so remarkable, and to think back to, when he was just a youngster living alone or living in Calgary, far from any real community and removed from his homeland, that he received Watermark, and that felt like a spark to him, and that a reminder that he wasn't alone in the world. And the fact that something that Monique and Coy and I pulled together 25 years ago actually touched someone in another country is just so remarkable, and it really reminds me of what a book can do.
And what about your own journey with publishing? Like, why was it difficult for you, or how did you go about even just trying to get this book published? We're a show for readers and writers, and I think, writers always kind of struggle with, well, what have I written here, and who would read it or want to publish it, and how do you make those decisions about where to take it, and who might be receptive to it?
Poetry doesn't make a lot of money. Not enough people buy poetry books, and they're expensive to publish for the independent presses. So I entered a lot of contests, and I got some good feedback along the way, but it took me a long time to both arrive at the manuscript in this form and to find what turned out to be an excellent home for the book. I'm so grateful to my editor, Jim Johnstone. He didn't know me at all, and I didn't have as much of a track record of publishing in Canada when I sent him the manuscript. And so, he was open to someone who didn't have a track record in this country, and he read the book and he contacted me so quickly, and I thought, well, this is a sign that
Yes.
I've found the right home. I think that is a key part of it. Number one, we are very fortunate here in Canada to have a very strong independent press showing, and so there are more choices here. I felt like in the US there were a lot of poetry contests, and if you don't win one of those, it's a little bit more difficult to place a manuscript, or at least that was my experience.
That's interesting. I wonder if there's something else that you would like to tell people about this book or your journey with this book that I haven't asked you about, that you feel like it's important for people to know, or why they might like to pick it up and read it.
A good question. I think part of my finally finding a home for this book had to do with, and I hope this is helpful to people who are trying to place a book, it had to do with my letting go of what I thought a book that would be accepted would look like. I think I had become so focused on trying to publish a book that I started shaping my manuscript for publication, as opposed to taking a step back and listening again to myself and what I actually wanted to say and how best to sing that song. And I think this is where the birds come back.
Yes.
When I was getting all those feathers, and I was living in LA, and there were just so many birds singing at all hours, and sometimes at night waking me up and getting me out of bed, and just listening to their song and the way they would sing it, whether anyone was listening or not, and how beautiful that was. I think something about that reminded me of the fact that I needed to sing my song whether someone was going to publish the book or not. I wanted it to sound the way I wanted it to sound. And I think when I finally returned to that place of trusting my voice and not trying to be some other poet, that the book found its home.
I think that's some great advice for any writer. But since we're talking so much about birds, perhaps you could choose another poem, one of the poems that really does reference the birds. But there's so many birds that you mentioned. You mentioned the raven and, of course, the parrot and cardinals. I'm just looking, the loon. And I'll let you choose which one. But they're all such beautiful poems. And, I read this book in one sitting. I was just so involved in it somehow from beginning to end. And I think the beauty of the birds just really struck a note with me. So I have to say, you really did find that song, and it has been heard. And
Thank you.
I really appreciate the effort you made to get it into this form.
I
Do you have a
appreciate that so much.
Do you have a particular one that you would like to read?
How about the first one, Raven Takes Wing?
Sure.
Raven takes wing. The first step is admitting it. I am a willful forgetter. I've taken this step many times. My bones are inclined to forget. The crick in my neck, the dull ache in my wrist. It should be obvious how they got this way. It is obvious. Somewhere in the recesses, black drongo, common kingfisher, I summon memories like birds. I assign them colors. If I admire the way they swoop and soar, dive and catch, if I separate myself from them, make them pretty things with wings, things outside myself, things that sing, things that eat the bugs that plague me, I can both remember them and send them scattering. Kite, cormorant, heron, the color of a pale amethyst. If I think of them this way, the way they move is not frightening. The way they plunge and peck, the way they persist, buoyed by a gust I cannot see. After Dionysus set tigers upon Amethistos, he wept, his rage transmuted into wine-colored tears that stained the girl Artemis had turned to stone. It's how amethysts got their color, how my memory, the one I keep trying to send into flight, was stained. Rage, an apology, the egret, a white flag, thin throat, thin song. It's impossible to hear egret without an echo, regret. My thoughts are scattering like sandpipers. I am falling out of reason. The birds are losing their feathers. The wind is forcing them to land. They are waving like flags, like surrender, like egrets, feet planted in thick mud.
Thank you so much. Are you doing any readings or appearances behind this book that you would like to tell people about?
I have 2 readings coming up in June, one with the Angel Reading Series and one at Flying Books with Suvankam Tamavongsa and Holly Flauto.
And where is Flying Books?
Also in Toronto.
So those are both happening in Toronto?
Yes, in June.
Uh-huh. And how would you like people to get in touch with you or find you on the internet or some other kind of way?
My website is barbaratran.com, and you can email me through there, and I'm on Blue Sky.
Barbara Tran, I want to thank you so much. This time has gone by so quickly here in the audio garden, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to talk with us and share some thoughts about your work.
It's such a pleasure to talk with you again, Martha.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.